Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're honored to have with us the internationally celebrated and award-winning Vermont author, Howard Norman. Howard, I did my homework here, Howard. You've come out with 8 novels, 3 memoirs, you've come out with some children's books, and now you also have graphic novels under your belt as well.
It's just staying the course, I think. I don't know each book is so different in its experience because one's life is different. But the wonderful poet William Merwin, W.S. Merwin, who is a very, very old friend and who passed away a number of years ago. In one of the last phone conversations I had with him, I lived in Maui, and he said, and he was blind at this point, and he was having his assistant read Borges's poems, obviously connecting with Borges's blindness too. But at one point, he said to me, and knowing him for oh goodness, almost 50 years, we had never spoken about writing before. It was always about everything else. And he said to me, "Have you written any books where you actually recognize your own nature, your own nature?" And I said, "This isn't some kind of like secret Buddhist question, is it, Bill? And I was trying to make him laugh, but he said, "No, I really want to know." And I said, "So I said maybe one." And we chatted about that, and I said, "Why are you asking this?" And he said, "Because here I am in my late 80s, and I'm thinking about it for the first time. Um, and he mentioned a particular poem that was about his father, and it was very revealing, but not ostentatiously confessional. And I said, "Well, do you regret um, not having written this kind of intimate thing earlier in your life?" He said, "Well, I don't have those kind of regrets, but one thing I can say that all one can do is stay the course, and you end up doing things you never would have imagined, 30, 40 years ago." And I've always remembered that as being quite a compelling thing to say. That that's about all you have. Some books have better lives than others, or the ups and downs. But if you can just, especially if you don't write formulaic books or procedurals in which there's a template that you're simply have an allegiance to. If you're really trying to move around and uh, write something different. So this last year, honestly, Barney, surprised me because, um, I finished a book about my friendship with the cartoonist Ed Koren, this haiku project we had. And so it seems to be that my late in life theme is friendship. Is I end up writing a lot of short little memoirs about friendship, and partly it's because all these people are dying. Which is, I don't mean to be maudlin about it, but it's just a fact. I'm 75, and these are one or two generations ahead of me. So they've been so formative and influential and uh, generous in their own ways. And so I think it's sort of natural to come into that stuff in writing, a kind of an elegiacal um, phase.
Right. Now, do you see yourself with, depending on the genre of book, whether they be memoir or nonfiction or children's books or graphic novels, as we mentioned as well, and other novels, do you have a certain theme for different genres?
Oh boy, that is. No, I wouldn't say that, but I think that there are certain refrains that are recognizable, certain being drawn to certain aspects of human behavior, I suppose I would say. Um, there's a letter that Chekhov wrote to his actress fiance, and he's describing a dinner he went to, and he says, "I know you're especially going to want to know about Victor, you know, Cosmos or somebody like that. And let me tell you that I haven't seen him in 20 years, but I realize in talking to him, he continues to apprentice himself to his worst instincts." And I just thought, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show how people sort of can't help how they behave, even when they recognize how they're behaving. And I think if there's one refrain that has been, oh, I don't know, uh, ubiquitous, it's that is you know people are both elegant and very awkward in life, and I'm interested in both those things. So I think in writing nonfiction, I try to use some of the elements of fiction, just structurally and tonally, and vice versa.
Hmm. I didn't even ask you this to be, and this should have been my first question to you: is what motivated you to even start writing in the first place?
I you know um, this will sound very much relativism, but I was not raised around books. I had no books in my home. There was Reader's Digest, but but there were libraries, and when I did spend half the year with my first cousins, then there were books. And just last night, my wife and a friend and I watched the new version of Count of Monte Cristo that's just out. And whatever one thinks of that, I think that that was the first book I actually read. I remember reading in an illustrated 3 volume Count of Monte Cristo, Alexander Dumas. And the reason I mention that is because I think that's when I really realized that you could think narratively, like that concept of actually creating something out of nothing. And I think
Hmm.
that that came very early on. I think my Jewish background, um, in reading commentaries on the Talmud, for instance, was really influential because it was all like Rashomon. There was 8 versions of the same opinion, and each of them were equally compelling. So I think that kind of formative stuff of reading in libraries, of a kind of formal um, education in reading sort of ancient texts and so forth. And then I think it was a really um, the most influential moment for me was working as an underage, illegal age bellhop at the Patland Hotel in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where my mother lived. And I was there underage and working in the afternoons and evenings at age 15. And sitting in the room with the custodial staff, the um, bellman, the working class, if you will, echelon of a fancy hotel, and hearing their versions and their understanding and their biographical impulses toward all the customers and the people who would come and go. That was hugely influential to me because I felt really boring. I wanted to be able to talk the way they talked.
Hmm.
And so I started to write stories, and they were all gangster stories.
Hmm.
They were just completely based on James Cagney type of movies. And, I was 15, but I wrote and wrote and wrote notebook after notebook of these stories, most of them set in this hotel.
Hmm.
And the lobbies of hotels and so forth stayed with me for 50 years of writing. So I would say that I didn't wake up one morning and say I wanted to be this. I just think that it was an early discovery that that would be the best way to organize my emotions.
Comparing your earlier works to some of your more present works, how has the interpersonal relationships of your protagonists um, in your books have evolved over time?
Oh well, that's the centralmost question,
Mm.
really. Uh, it's that um, I don't want to sound self-deprecating. It's just simply the um, evolution of writing a lot. Is that if I were to look back at earlier novels, I would recognize a more self-conscious way of developing them as characters. I grew less interested in the formalities of character development the older I got. And so the novels, and it may be the reason they don't sell in the millions, is that I tried to make a person's character like how life is, which is sort of rather unpredictable, ad hoc, and gatherings of disparate elements into some structure and form. So yeah, I became much more comfortable once I started writing memoir
Mm.
with the fiction I was writing. That had a huge effect on me.
And so, what do you prefer then? Either, like you said, the fiction or the memoir? Because some are based off of reflection, the other ones are based off of nostalgia in a way, right?
Well, I mean, I, I never thought of myself as a novelist. I mean, and saying that for all the luck I have had and good fortune, which has been really lovely. But I always sort of felt myself as a kind of folklorist, which was my formal training at Indiana University, the Folklore Institute. And because I was always interested in the kind of um, where, when you recognize that a reader might have to suspend disbelief, how do you work with that so that they don't have to?
Mm.
How do you uh, weave that into a story so that something that seems outlandish is really quotidian? And that all came from really studying folk tales.
Mm.
And so I'm much more comfortable with nonfiction lately. I don't know that I'll write another novel, but I do have definitely another nonfiction book I'm working on, and I'm just steeped in it. I'm enjoying it as much as I'm able to get to it. I'm a little inarticulate about these things because these are questions that, um, in a way, you don't want to overly think about those questions when you're writing because a certain kind of censorship comes in
Right.
rather than if you're just, than if you're just writing. But I would have to say that on the on the level of just uh, the the act of writing, of sitting down and working, certainly the last 4 or 5, 6 years, the nonfiction has been much more gratifying. I mean, you can't
Mm.
even compare the two on some level, but so you can only just describe the autonomous experience of each book. But one gets to the point where maybe you have told the stories in fiction that you needed to tell. There's other things to do.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. So as a folklorist and a storyteller, but also someone that is involved in nonfiction, How do you balance historical accuracy with, say, the creative liberties of fiction in your novels?
Yeah, I'm very fond of something that Ruskin said. And he this came up, and back in the day, and somebody was complaining about um, a heavily nuanced description of an actual historical event. And Ruskin said, I think for a writer of fiction who is writing historical fiction, that writer should be alert to the claims of fact, but not oppressed by them.
Hmm.
And and I agree with that. I mean, Ian McEwan wrote a novel about First World War, and he got a lot of factual things a little bit. Well, they weren't wrong, Barney. They simply weren't necessarily. Um, he wasn't demonstrating the efficacy of research every page. He was writing a fictional book, and yet he came under a lot of flack for that. And I always think of that Ruskin phrase. Yes, you when fact is useful and it fits into the overall demeanor and atmosphere that you're trying to hit, great.
Hmm.
I mean, this book, Come to the Window, which was just came out, and it's set during the Spanish flu, during the First World War, um, and some reviewers saw it as a an allegory of COVID, but I had no intention of that at all. That was just
Hmm.
happenstance to me. It was very researched, and all the things. In a whale gets blown up, and a woman who had murdered her husband stuffs the revolver she shot him with down the blowhole of a whale. Absolutely taken out of articles in the Halifax Gazette. But if you say to somebody, "Oh, this person shot her husband on their wedding night, and then um, stuffed the revolver down the blowhole of a whale who had tumbled onto the beach," that's all just absolutely fact.
Hmm.
But the order in which you put those in creates the fiction.
Hmm.
I mean, it's like we don't remember things in the order in which they happened.
Right.
I mean, most of us don't. I don't.
What are some other insights into the research process for your books?
I had this theory that one should stop researching when what they're finding out starts to trespass on what you imagined happened.
Hmm.
And I found that actually happened in each of those early novels every time. There was a
Huh.
point in which I started to realize that I was done with the research, and because otherwise, why not write a nonfiction book? So I wrote this novel called The Museum Guard, and I interviewed so many museum guards around the world. I just endless stories, notebook after notebook. And when I came back and looked at those before I started writing, I realized that the whole book really was based on one moment that happened in a museum in Seattle, Washington. And this museum happened to have a lot of Joseph Cornell boxes. And I walked into that museum, and there was a somewhat older museum guard. And I said, "Can you tell me where the Joseph Cornell boxes are?" And he was very snippy. And he said, "Why don't you ask my know it all nephew over there, who's the other museum guard?" And the whole book that night in a hotel was outlined. It was about their relationship. And all those hundreds of interviews just were never used. But those were factual things. Those were full of facts of what museum guards lived and what they looked for and all that. And very little of that got in the book because it was replaced by this one moment. So, research is I've always found it very lovely and very necessary, but how it ends up to be part of a novel is really, really unpredictable.
Mm.
In my experience, other writers would speak very differently about it than me.
And so, what advice would you give aspiring writers then, Howard, about capturing the essence of a time period authentically?
Well, I don't know that I can impart anything that's of any use seriously, except that I would say this, that um, sometimes I feel like you don't need to make much up. You just have to describe things really well. And I really think it's just a craft thing, Barney, is that, rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. Because you could say to somebody, guess what? This, uh, this blimp just landed in my backyard. And as a fact, that's really not very compelling to me.
Mm.
But the whole context of where you were, how did you see it, what the neighbors responded to, then it becomes a narrative. So, it's the enhancement of fact, or as Pascal said, giving fact a more exciting home than it would have otherwise had.
That's a good line.
And I do believe in this kind of thing. It's not everyone's cup of tea. I read a one of my very favorite writers is the Austrian writer Max Frisch, and Max Frisch's book Montauk is just about as close to a completely autobiographical description of an affair he had as you can get. But you certainly realize you're reading a novel,
Right.
because you feel the writer's personality and their, well, like Merwin said, their actual nature, to not just be satisfied with just the facts of what happened.
Mm.
So I think, I mean, I stopped teaching 4 or 5 years ago, but I remember in workshops, especially with international students, that the thing that opened them up was to take the, I guess you would almost say, the narrative logistics, the organizing principles of fiction, and apply it to nonfiction and vice versa.
Mm.
And I was able to talk to them about that because not only had I done it, but some of my favorite writers had done it. And uh, um, so that's the advice I would have, is just read and take whatever is useful to you.
Mm. So I'm kind of curious. Is like we're looking at um, putting on your future hat here. Where do you see the future of literary fiction and this increasingly digital and multimedia world?
Well, I know that there are a lot of, I do realize that there, and I acknowledge it, there are a lot of people, perhaps especially of my generation, but maybe not exclusively, who are very despondent and perhaps maybe even feel a kind of emotional entropy about literature. But I
Mm.
feel the opposite. I feel there's always phases in literature. There's just phases where identity politics might dominate for a while, or something like that. But you remember, Barney? I mean, I'm considerably older than you, but remember, when 100 Years of Solitude was published, and I just remember that this incredible flow of Latin American writing came out in the next 3 or 4 years, thanks to many translators. And people were saying, well, we just didn't know. But this literature had been evolving for centuries.
Mm.
And so I feel very, I don't, how should I say it? I don't feel optimistic right now about the publishing industry. I think conglomerates, all that kind of stuff, and I'm just speaking in cliches here. And yet, for instance, there's more poetry published now than ever before because university presses and independent presses have taken up this responsibility. So it just means that you can often find the best literature in not necessarily mainstream publishing. And I think it's a phase, and I think you just have to constantly be researching it and on the outlook for it. I mean, New Directions, New York Review of Books, these are extraordinary publishing enterprises. And they're reintroducing whole, the way you were talking about with your radio show, they're reintroducing whole decades of writers who were extraordinary writers in their time. And so I'm not that optimistic right now about the, how should I say it, the politics of publishing or the conglomerate kind of things. The I just believe in eclecticism and the constant investigation into which writers are out there. You know, I remember in the late '90s going into a bookstore in Amsterdam and seeing um, not only writers I never would have known, but seeing um, translations in Dutch, German, French, so on and so forth. We have a very ethnocentric publishing business here.
Hmm.
It's only when someone wins the Nobel Prize or something that other and I so I'm optimistic that there's so many more African writers. There's so many more writers from all sorts of countries now than certainly when I was growing up. So I feel very excited about that and very grateful for it. That often is at direct odds, though, with the business aspects of publishing, which, of course, you're very aware of because you interview authors.
Hmm.
I always feel like writing's a great life and a very difficult business.
That's true.
You know, it sounds like a silly platitude, but some books don't do very well, and some books do, and but if you can just keep working, I think.
So, Howard, you said Come to the Window is potentially your final novel. Is that true?
Well, I don't think prediction is anything but melodramatic, but I kind of know, you do get to know yourself a little bit
Hmm.
and where your curiosities are going and where your sense of maybe even subtle sense of experimentation um and and you know it's not that I'm beginning every thought with the Old Testament locution in the hours still left to me, but I do really realize I'm of an age, and I there are things I would like to write. Um, that fiction probably, I mean, my guess is that fiction probably isn't going to be the best way to do that. But it's not about regretting or anything. I stand by all my novels for all their flaws, and believe me, I recognize all their flaws. So I'm just, this is my thinking now. Uh, 5 years from now, who knows? But I kind of feel this way now that the nonfiction and the creative nonfiction, if you will, is
Hmm.
really, really compelling right now to me.
So, Howard, if people want to follow you and learn more about your work, where's the best place they could go to?
My wife, um, no, just kidding, Jane. Um, uh, that's a good question. I don't, Barney. I really don't know how to answer that. I suppose just to books, the books themselves, or sit in a library and look. Um, I think. I mean, there's a number of things online. I think like short interviews, but I think the happy thing for a writer is that if books stay in print, which some of mine do and some don't so much, or they come back into print. Somebody's always discovering them.
Right.
Somebody younger, and you get an email or a letter or something like that. Oddly enough, just about 2 months ago, when I refused to be a war bride, that little episode came out. A woman who refused to be a war bride when she came to Halifax in 1940 called me on the phone. And I had interviewed her when I was 20 years old because I had intended to write a book about women who refused to be war brides even once they arrived to Canada. And I found out all sorts of stories about that. And that was a big project that I wrote hundreds of pages, and it was awful. It failed completely, but I never lost interest in the courage that must have taken for somebody to step off that ship and say, no, do with me what you will, but I'm not going to do this.
Mm.
And some of the repercussions were legal and financial, and others were surprising. And so all these years later, it kind of came back in this little graphic novel.
Huh.
So stories sometimes, they percolate for ages.
Right. So like you said, Howard, before we went on the interview, I did point out that you had a website and you didn't know you had a website, right?
I did not know that.
It has all your about the author page on here. It
Oh,
has your contact
oh
information.
goodness. Yeah. Oh, I think that came from a while back when I was taking on individual manuscripts to edit, which I still take on one or two a year at the most.
At
I don't think I've ever,
howardnorman.com.
I don't think I've ever actually seen that visually, Barney.
It looks like a great website.
But
Whoever
Barney,
did it did a good job.
you'll understand when I show you this. This is really what my writing life is. This old Royal typewriter that I bought when I was 22.
Wow.
That's still it, man. And somebody said, "Why do you still write on this thing?" I said, "Because it stops when I stop." you know.
Good
Yeah.
deal.
So I'm not a fossil quite yet, a dinosaur quite yet, but certainly, um, certainly one feels maybe connected to certain eras in writing a little more, but I really feel connected to writers like George Eliot, who I could never write like, but I love their writing.
Huh.
You get to choose what era you want to really mentally live in.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know how that is for you, but it sounds to me like those old radio detective things are where
Yes.
that you actually live there
Yeah. I
in
love
a
it.
certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is great. So it was a fantastic time talking to you, Howard. And if you do get a new book out, come back on and we'll chat some more.
Well, I hope to, and I'd love it. It's been a great pleasure and very enjoyable, and I'm grateful that you asked me.